A wall is falling. That is what most people remember about Jericho. The trumpets, the march around the city, the wall collapsing flat on the seventh day of the seventh circuit, Joshua chapter 6. It is one of the most cinematic images in the Hebrew Bible. An army marching in silence, priests blowing ram's horns, the Ark of the Covenant carried at the center, and then the walls of Jericho falling outward and a city taken without a battle. For 3,000 years, this story stood as the founding moment of Israel in Canaan. The text places it in vivid detail: Joshua's strategy, the shout that brought the walls down, the total destruction of the city, Rahab the prostitute hidden in the wall, her household spared. But in 1952, a British archaeologist arrived at the actual site of Jericho with a trowel and a question. What she found over the next 6 years became one of the most disruptive discoveries in the history of biblical archaeology. And she didn't find the walls. Today we go back to the oldest city on Earth, the actual mound, the actual layers, and we find out what the ground there actually holds and what it doesn't. Before we go further, let me show you what the ground holds. Jericho is not just an old city, it is the oldest continuously inhabited place ever excavated. The site is called es-Sultan. It sits in the Jordan Valley about 10 kilometers north of the Dead Sea, beside a permanent spring that has flowed for tens of thousands of years. Archaeologists have identified 23 distinct settlement layers at the site. The earliest dates to approximately 9000 BCE. That makes Jericho older than agriculture, older than the wheel, older than writing, older than every other city on every other site ever excavated anywhere. By the time of Abraham, Jericho was already 8,000 years old. By the time of Moses, it was nearly 10,000. And by the time Joshua's army would have approached the site, approximately 1400 BCE according to a traditional reading, or 1200 BCE according to a later one, Jericho had already been built, destroyed, rebuilt, and reoccupied so many times that the entire mound rose more than 20 meters above the surrounding valley floor. This is not a story set in a young city fresh on the landscape. This is a story set in the oldest place human beings have ever consistently lived. In January 1952, a British archaeologist named Kathleen Kenyon arrived at es-Sultan with the joint expedition to Jericho. She was 45 years old, the daughter of the director of the British Museum, and she was about to change biblical archaeology forever. Before Kenyon, the most influential excavator of Jericho had been John Garstang, a British archaeologist who had dug the site between 1930 and 1936. Garstang had announced something extraordinary. He claimed to have found Joshua's walls, massive fortifications of mud brick that had collapsed outward, and he dated them to approximately 1400 BCE. For nearly 2 decades, this was treated as confirmation of the biblical account. Kenyon brought a different method to the same mound. She used what archaeologists now call the Wheeler-Kenyon technique, digging in small, precise vertical sections, recording every layer in fine stratigraphic detail, and using pottery typology to date each level with much greater accuracy than had ever been done at the site before. Over 6 excavation seasons from 1952 to 1958, Kenyon and her team produced a detailed record of every settlement layer at es-Sultan. Her conclusions, published in the following years, were devastating to the traditional reading. The walls Garstang had identified as Joshua's were not from 1400 BCE, they were from approximately 2400 BCE, 1,000 years too early. And the layer that corresponded to the period when Joshua's army would have arrived, the Late Bronze Age, around 1400 to 1200 BCE, showed something else entirely. There was almost nothing there. Here is what most readings miss. When Kathleen Kenyon excavated the Late Bronze Age layer at Jericho, the layer that should contain Joshua's city, she did not find walls collapsed outward. She did not find the rubble of a destroyed metropolis. She did not find evidence of a great battle. She found a small unwalled settlement, a village really, a few houses, a handful of pottery shards, some grain storage pits. The great walled city of the Joshua narrative was not there. Not in 1400 BCE, not in 1300 BCE, not in 1200 BCE. The site had been abandoned for most of that period. What occupation existed was minimal: herders, farmers, a small population clinging to the spring, but nothing that resembled a fortified city. So either Joshua attacked a place that wasn't what the text describes, or the text is describing something else entirely. Now, this is where the conversation gets complicated, and honesty matters more than certainty. Some scholars push back on Kenyon's findings. Some argue her dating methods missed evidence. Others propose that the destruction layer is there, but harder to identify because of erosion at the top of the mound. A few more recent excavators have argued that small destruction events from the right period do exist. They're just less dramatic than the biblical account suggests. But the central problem doesn't go away. The late Bronze Age Jericho that Kenyon documented is not the city described in Joshua 6. It is too small, too unfortified, too quiet. So what was the writer of Joshua doing? The most honest answer is that the book of Joshua is not a battlefield report. It was composed centuries after the events it describes, likely during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, or during the reforms of King Josiah in the late 7th century. That is between 600 and 800 years after the events. The writers were not eyewitnesses, they were theologians. They were working from older traditions, oral histories, fragments of ancient poetry, memories preserved in the cultural imagination of a people who had lost their land and were trying to understand how they had ever held it. The fall of Jericho in the text is not necessarily a description of one military event. It is a theological statement about how Israel believed God had given them the land. The wall that falls flat when the priests blow trumpets is not primarily a wall, it is a claim. A claim that the land of Canaan was not taken by military strategy, or by superior weapons, or by political alliance. It was given. And the silence at the bottom of the mound, the small unwalled village that Kenyon found, is not a problem, it's a key. It tells us that the text is not measuring the same thing the archaeologist is measuring. Before we land this, let's look at what the ground at Jericho genuinely does preserve. Because Kenyon found more than absences. She found the oldest stone tower ever built. At the very bottom of the mound, in the Neolithic layers dating to around 8000 BCE, Kenyon's team uncovered a circular stone tower nearly 9 meters high and almost 10 meters across at the base. The tower has an internal staircase of 22 steps. It is built from massive undressed stones. It is the oldest known monumental structure anywhere on Earth, older than the pyramids by 4,000 years, older than Stonehenge by 5,000. Older than every city wall in every other excavated site in the entire ancient Near East. What was it for? No one knows for certain. Some scholars argue it was defensive. Others suggest it was astronomical, aligned with the summer solstice sunset. But its existence proves something important. 11,000 years ago, the people living at the spring in Jericho were already organizing themselves to build something massive together. The site has memory deeper than any text can reach. In other layers, Kenyon found something even stranger. A set of human skulls with the bones removed and replaced with carefully sculpted plaster faces, seashells inserted where the eyes had been. 9 of them have been recovered from Jericho. They date to approximately 7000 BCE. They are among the oldest known artistic representations of the human face anywhere in the world. We don't know exactly what they were for. Ancestor veneration is the leading theory, but these are not the artifacts of a small or marginal place. Jericho was central to its world for thousands of years before the Bible was written. The Book of Joshua is one chapter in a story that the ground has been telling for 11,000 years. Step back. What does the archaeology of es-Sultan, combined with what we can understand from the text, actually indicate? It indicates that the writers of Joshua were not writing a military history in the modern sense. They were doing something harder. They were trying to explain how a people had come to inhabit a land they had no obvious natural claim to, and how to understand the loss of that land when it happened again, centuries later. The fall of Jericho in the text is the founding image of Israel and Canaan. It is the moment that establishes not just possession but theology. The walls do not fall because of military genius. They do not fall because of superior weapons. They do not fall because of long siege warfare. They fall because of trumpets blown by priests, walked around the city by an army that does not fight. The strategic value of this image is exactly 0. You cannot take a city by walking around it. The writers of Joshua knew this perfectly well. Their contemporary readers knew this perfectly well. The story is not telling you how Joshua won a battle. It is telling you what kind of God the people of Israel believed had given them the land. A God whose power was not contained in military strategy. A God who could be invited through music and ritual rather than commanded through weapons and walls. And here is where the archaeology and the theology meet at the same place. The actual ground at Jericho, the 11,000 years of human occupation, the impossibly old stone tower, the plastered skulls, the unwalled late Bronze Age village. All of it tells us that the story is older and stranger than any single battle. The Book of Joshua is not lying to us. It's doing something different from what we asked it to do. It is telling us how a people understood their own beginning, and that beginning, for them, was not measured in stones falling outward. It was measured in something much older, a spring that has flowed for 40,000 years, a place that has held human attention across every era of human history. The walls that did or did not fall are not the most important thing about Jericho. The most important thing about Jericho is that the ground there remembers longer than any text could, and the text is one voice in a much older conversation between humans and a place they could not stop returning to. If this changed how you see Jericho, if those 11,000 years feel closer and stranger than they did 15 minutes ago, share it with someone who needs it, and we'll see you in the next one.